The 9,881st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Majid Abdulaziz, Permanent Observer of the League of Arab States to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam President, and I welcome the opportunity to update the Security Council on the humanitarian crisis. Overnight, our worst fears materialized. Airstrikes resumed across the entire Gaza Strip. Unconfirmed reports of hundreds of people killed. New evacuation orders issued by Israeli forces, and once again, the people of Gaza living in abject fear. Modest gains made during the ceasefire destroyed. Humanitarian workers remain on the ground. I'm in close touch with them, ready to provide life-saving support to survivors and carry out our humanitarian mission. We must be allowed to do so. Last month, Madam President, I visited the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel to meet survivors, frontline workers, and authorities. In Israel, I met with survivors of the horrendous Hamas-led attacks on 7th of October at the Nir Oz kibbutz. I will never forget my visit there. 1 in 4 people killed or taken hostage. In the West Bank, I met with families whose homes were demolished and who faced daily threats of eviction and forcible displacement. And yet, compared to now, my trip coincided with some of Gaza's better recent days. A ceasefire was in place. Humanitarians were delivering hundreds of trucks every day, saving lives and restoring hope. We demonstrated that when we are allowed to do so, we can deliver aid at scale. Not anymore. Today, I'm distressed to report that in addition to the intense airstrikes that have resumed, since the 2nd of March, Israeli authorities have cut off the entry of all life-saving supplies, food, medicines, fuel, cooking gas, for 2.1 million people. Our repeated requests to collect aid sitting at Kerem Shalom crossing have been systematically rejected. Food is rotting and medicines are expiring. No further hostages have been released. Only medical evacuations and humanitarian staff rotations have continued. And even those came to a halt today. During the ceasefire, we surged support after more than a year of aid being placed on a drip feed. The suspension of aid and commercial materials is reversing that progress that we achieved during that brief period. Essential survival resources needed are now being rationed. Israel has cut power to southern Gaza's desalination plant, limiting access to clean water for 600,000 people. The price of staples have surged. Vegetable prices in North Gaza have tripled. 6 bakeries subsidized by the World Food Programme have closed. due to shortages of cooking gas. The World Health Organization warns that public health risks remain very high, including for communicable diseases, from overcrowding and poor sanitation. This total blockade of life-saving aid, basic commodities, and commercial goods will have a disastrous impact on the people of Gaza, who remain dependent on the steady flow of assistance into the Strip. Madam President, as Gaza is cut off again, our ability to deliver assistance and basic services is becoming harder. Funding levels for the response are extremely low. We're seeing increasing restrictions being placed on NGO partners who are critical of the aid operation, not only in Gaza, but across the OPT. Since the Knesset legislation formally took effect on the 30th of January 2025, UNRWA international staff are no longer able to rotate in and out of Gaza. The amount of cash that humanitarian personnel can bring into Gaza has been further decreased to a half of previous levels, far below what is required to cover even basic expenses for a 6-week rotation. On the 9th of March, Israeli authorities introduced new registration rules for international NGOs delivering humanitarian aid to Palestinians in the OPT. If enforced, these would impose strict conditions and significantly disrupt aid operations. The Israeli Knesset is also considering a bill to impose considerable taxation on donations from third states to Israeli NGOs, including humanitarian and human rights groups. If implemented, this would further erode the number of partners with the capacity to implement protection interventions. Many Israeli NGOs are engaged on legal cases involving home demolitions and forced evictions. They also provide protective presence activities related to settler violence. We continue to give what remains inside Gaza to those most in need. We are trucking water where we can, providing reduced food rations, and distributing shelter items. We continue to support hospitals with supplies, emergency medical teams, and casualty evacuations to hospitals in Gaza. Our education partners report that about 631 temporary learning spaces are now operational throughout Gaza, supporting over 172,000 students. But we cannot sustain this for much longer unless the crossings are opened again for aid to enter. Madam President, the 42-day ceasefire proved what was possible. Aid delivery was enabled, and we scaled up quickly and effectively. 30 hostages and 8 deceased hostages and 583 Palestinian detainees were released during that period. Criminal activity in Gaza was brought under control, reducing the looting of humanitarian convoys by armed Palestinians. Over 4,000 trucks of aid per week entered Gaza. We reached over 2 million people, 540 water delivery points set up, 113,000 tents distributed to families by the UN humanitarian partners and others. Our polio vaccination targets were exceeded, reaching over 600,000 children. Maternity kits were expanded to support 5,000 births. Thousands of postpartum kits were distributed for mothers and newborns. It proves what's possible when we're allowed to do our job. We cannot and must not accept a return to pre-ceasefire conditions or the complete denial of humanitarian relief. Civilians must be protected. Their essential needs must be met. International law must be respected. Madam President, I also have grave concerns about the protection of civilians in the West Bank. The situation there is an urgent crisis that must be addressed with the necessary international attention. Since the start of this year, 95 Palestinians have been killed, including 17 children, and 869 have been injured, including 179 children. The Israeli military has renewed wide-scale operations in the northern West Bank, deploying tanks for the first time in 2 decades. 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced in these operations, including from refugee camps and cities. Civilian infrastructure has been extensively destroyed. In Area C, Palestinian communities continue to be coerced off their land by settlement expansion, settler violence, and home demolitions. Hundreds of Israeli settlers have launched large-scale attacks on Palestinian villages, burning homes and destroying property. Over 800 movement obstacles, including over 20 new road gates and checkpoint closures, are severely disrupting Palestinians' access to work, healthcare, and essential services. Restrictions by Israeli authorities continue to prevent thousands of Palestinian worshippers from reaching holy sites. Madam President, three things need to happen right now. First and foremost, humanitarian aid and commercial essentials must be allowed to enter Gaza. Blocking food, water, medicine for people who need them is unconscionable. It also goes against international humanitarian law and the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice. Second, we must renew the ceasefire. Over 48,000 Palestinians have been killed and thousands more are missing. Over 1,200 Israelis have been killed. Over 100,000 Palestinians are injured, many with life-changing wounds. The return to hostilities overnight must cease. The suffering of the people of the region must end. A renewed ceasefire is the best way of protecting civilians in Gaza, in the OPT, and in Israel, releasing hostages and detainees, and allowing aid and commercial supplies in. And third, the humanitarian response must be funded. We have received only 4% of what is needed. We don't even have enough to get through this quarter. In closing, I am reminded of a message I saw scrawled on a hospital whiteboard in Gaza, written by a doctor who was later killed. A message that has stuck with me. Whoever stays until the end will tell the story. We did what we could. Remember us. Madam President, colleagues on the Security Council, will we be able to say that we did what we could? Thank you.
And I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, at the outset, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Mr. Tom Fletcher for his sobering and alarming briefing. Algeria requested this meeting to address the blockade on Gaza, but recent development have made it more urgent and necessary as we witness another chapter of collective punishment being inflicted upon the people of Gaza. This is not a routine briefing on the ongoing suffering enduring by the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. This is not simply an account of deprivation. It is a plea for justice against an Israeli occupying authority that has weaponized starvation as a tool of war. This is, without a doubt, a war crime. The time has come for accountability. No one is above the law. Today, the world can no longer ignore the grim reality of the Israeli occupation. Today, the truth about the Israeli occupation overload for so long can no longer be hidden. As Algerians, we know, we understand the cruelty and the oppression of the occupation because we have enduring it for over 130 years. Occupation, the most horrible, the most shameful chapter in modern history, continues to wreak havoc, and it must be ended wherever it exists. Madam President, for now over 2 weeks, not a single aid truck have been allowed to enter Gaza. Not one. This deliberate blockade, timed to coincide with the holy month of Ramadan, is a calculated effort to break the resilience of the Palestinian people. With nearly 18 months of hunger already endured, 80% of Gaza's population has seen their sources of food vanished. Yet, as if starving people weren't enough, the Israeli occupying power is using water, yes, water, as a weapon of war. UNICEF reports that only 1 of 10 people in Gaza have access to clean water. And Israel has also taken the step of cutting off Gaza's electricity supply. The result? The sole desalination plant in Gaza is about to shut down, leaving an already weakened population without clean water. Without clean water. Are we really going to wait until more lives succumb to hunger and to epidemic? Madam President, this is not just about withholding aid. The Israeli occupation has targeted the entire Gaza's food system, making it impossible for the people to feed themselves today, and very difficult to sustain themselves in the future. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Mr. Michael Fakhri, Israel is not merely obstructing aid. It is methodically dismantling Gaza's food infrastructure. Moreover, after attacking UNRWA, the backbone of Gaza's humanitarian aid, Israel, as an occupying power, has imposed new restrictions on all NGOs, thus creating new administrative obstacles to their ability to operate and assist the Palestinian people. The Palestinian NGO network has rightfully condemned this move, calling it a deliberate attempt to silence international aid organizations and isolate Palestinian voices from the global community. Amidst this humanitarian catastrophe, the Israeli occupying forces brazenly took the liberty of killing Palestinians, completely disregarding the ceasefire agreement. Just this night, just last night, the Israeli forces have launched a series of indiscriminate airstrikes across Gaza, resulting in the death of more 400 people, the majority of them women and children. Once again, Palestinian blood is being used as a tool for the political calculations of the Israeli politicians. We condemn firmly these attacks, which constitute a violation of the ceasefire agreement reached 2 months ago. And we remind all parties that Resolution 2735 guarantees the continuation of the ceasefire as long as negotiations are ongoing. We also emphasize the responsibility of the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, in ensuring compliance with the ceasefire agreement. Madam President, the International Court of Justice has already spoken on this matter. In its provisional measures, the ICJ has ordered Israel as the occupying power to immediately take all necessary actions to ensure the unimpeded delivery of urgent humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. This includes the provision of basic services such as food, water, electricity, fuel, medical care, and sanitation. This very council, in its resolutions, has called for safe and unhindered humanitarian access. Yet, the Israeli occupying power continue not only to ignore international law, including the resolutions adopted by this Council, but to kill indiscriminately innocent Palestinian civilians. Madam President, we wonder what those who consistently invoke a so-called Israel's right to self-defense will say in response to this cruelty, to these atrocities. In Gaza, we are witnessing the systematic degradation of human dignity, the deliberate stripping away of the right of life, the right to life, to food, to water, and to basic human dignity. In Gaza, we are witnessing the demise of the values and principles that should be the foundation of international order: equality, humanity, justice. In Gaza, we are witnessing cowardice and brutality of the Israeli occupation that is in full display with no regard for innocent lives. Still silent, faced to these atrocities, the relevance of this Council is seriously questioned. Will it ever dare to take responsibility? Will it ever act to stop this genocide and preserve what remains, if any, of its credibility? I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to begin by thanking USG Fletcher for his sovereign briefings and on the latest development in Gaza. The scale of destruction and loss of life demands our immediate attention and action. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza has reached unprecedented level of severity. We express our profound concern about the inconceivable decisions on March 2nd to halt humanitarian aid in Gaza by Israel to a territory where over 2 million people, including 1 million children, are desperately struggling to survive. The suspension of humanitarian operation at a time when humanitarian needs are at their most critical threatens to completely unravel the already fragile humanitarian response. UNRWA's role is irreplaceable, and its services are indispensable for the survival of millions of Palestinians. We categorically reject Israel's use of starvation as weapons and any humanitarian attempt to use humanitarian aid as bargaining chip in ceasefire negotiations. This represents continuation of grave breach of international law and instrumentalization of humanitarian aid. As the Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, rightly stated, humanitarian aid is not negotiable. It must flow without impediment as required by the international law and basic human dignity. Israel, as occupying power, has the obligation under the international law to ensure civilian access essential goods services, including humanitarian assistance. We express our strongest condemnation of today's Israeli airstrike in Gaza that has claimed more than 400 innocent people, marking one of the deadliest days since the conflict began. Such indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations are not only morally indefensible, but constitutes serious violation of international humanitarian law. This dangerous escalation threatens to plunge the region back into full-scale war at a time when humanitarian needs are most acute. We must address the escalating violence in the West Bank, where IDF operations have intensified dramatically, resulting in the numerous Palestinian casualties, including women and children. Additionally, the illegal expansion of settlement, demolition of homes, and systematic violence against Palestinian civilians represent a dangerous pattern of aggression that threatens to further destabilize the region. A definitive ceasefire now is the first step to ensure the population, including women and children, are protected from further physical and psychological harm. In that vein, we underscore the paramount priority of fully implementing the ceasefire agreement in its second and third phases, while ensuring all parties, in particular Israel, honors its commitment in a manner consistent with international law obligations. On the occasion of the holy month of Ramadan, we call for the de-escalation across the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as an access for worshippers to blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque to free and safely perform their religious rituals in full preservation of the legal and historic status quo of the holy site in the occupied Jerusalem. The pursuit of just and a comprehensive peace remains our strategic imperative. In that regard, the end of the occupation and full recognition of a free, sovereign, independent Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital in accordance with the relevant resolutions remains the only sustainable option for the resolutions on this long-standing conflict. The international community must stand against any attempt to alter the demographic composition of forcibly displaced Palestinians from their camps and cities or annex any part of the West Bank or Gaza under any pretext. Such actions will constitute Gaza under any pretext. Such actions will constitute grave violations of international law and amount to ethnic cleansing. Madam President, as we deliberate in this chamber, people of Gaza, in particular children and women, are counting the hours until their next meal, if it comes at all. Mothers are rationing drops of water among their families while bombs are being dropped on their shelters. Medical workers are performing surgeries by using mobile phone lights. This is not just a crisis of resource, it's a crisis of our collective conscience. Let our decisions today reflect our humanity. It's our moral imperative to protect innocent lives and pursue justice and lasting peace in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this meeting of the United Nations Security Council has been called to address the worsening humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip following the humanitarian blockade imposed by the government of the State of Israel. With the devastating bombing across Gaza in the past 24 hours, it is evident that this meeting is being held when there is a direct violation of the ceasefire. Let me thank Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Tom Fletcher, for his important and sobering briefing. Sierra Leone acknowledges the continued leadership of United Nations and the dedication of all humanitarian entities and personnel in responding to the dire humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. The ceasefire agreement reached by the government of Israel and Hamas in January 2025 was a significant development, demonstrating the potential of good faith engagement and political will in achieving tangible progress. However, while the agreement reduced violence, its implementation has been marred by severe challenges that demanded urgent redress and continued engagement. Madam President, colleagues, most critically, for over 2 weeks, the government of Israel completely suspended the entry of humanitarian aid and commercial supplies into the Gaza Strip. The consequences of this blockade have been devastating, deepening the suffering of civilians and exacerbating an already dire humanitarian crisis. The deliberate withholding of food, water, medical supplies, and electricity, particularly when imposed on a besieged population already facing extreme hardship, constitute, in our view, collective punishment, a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Since March 2nd, humanitarian aid has been completely blocked from entering Gaza, leaving 1.9 million displaced persons without food, medical care, or other life-sustaining assistance. The United Nations Relief and Work Agency, UNRWA, and other humanitarian organizations have reported massive shortage of food, medicine, and medical supplies, further exacerbating the dire conditions in overcrowded shelters and hospitals. Of particular concern are reports from UNFPA and UNICEF regarding the prolonged denial of reproductive health services for women and girls, further violating their rights to health and dignity. The cutting off of electricity has worsened the crisis, rendering hospitals and health facilities unable to operate critical life-saving equipment. The collapse of the main desalination and purification plant has deprived thousands of families, including children, of access to clean drinking water, exacerbating the risk of waterborne diseases and severe malnutrition. Under international law, the State of Israel, as the occupying power, has clear obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention, requiring it to ensure the provision of food and medical supplies to the civilian population, to maintain medical and hospital services, and to allow and facilitate humanitarian relief operations and their rapid distribution. The deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid in Gaza is a serious violation of these obligations. Additionally, Sierra Leone recalls the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in 2024 in the South Africa versus Israel case, which specifically required the government of Israel to take immediate steps to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access into Gaza. The continued blockade defies the court's binding ruling and further endangers the civilian population. It appears there is a manifest pattern of conduct directed at the Palestinian people that should cause this council to sound the alarm, as others have done. The airstrikes by the Israel Defense Forces in Beit Lahia, northern Gaza, reported to have killed 8 workers and journalists 3 days ago, raised grave concerns about a potential resurgence of hostilities after the ceasefire respite, increasing the risk of regional escalation and reversing the fragile gains made since the ceasefire. It has been further reported that overnight, the IDF carried out extensive strikes in the Gaza Strip, with more than 400 Palestinians reported to have been killed. Are these actions not a deliberate infliction of condition of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the Palestinian people? The collective punishment, indiscriminate killings, and withholding of food, water, and medical supplies essential for survival? Like a canary in the coal mine, we must sound the alarm. The intentional deprivation of humanitarian aid, when combined with the scale of suffering, displacement, and reported rhetoric from high-ranking officials advocating for such measures, raising serious concerns. This Council and the international community has a duty to act and to fulfill its obligations. Sierra Leone calls on the Security Council to take urgent action to ensure the immediate and full resumption of humanitarian aid to Gaza and to uphold international humanitarian law. We stress the importance of, first, reaffirming that the State of Israel, as the occupying power, must comply with its obligation under the Fourth Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. Second, ensuring full compliance with the ICJ's provisional measures which demand unimpeded humanitarian access. Third, supporting the protection of humanitarian workers who continue to risk their lives to deliver essential services under severe restrictions. UNRWA, UNICEF, and WHO remain critical actors in sustaining the fragile healthcare system and addressing the needs of premature newborns, young children, and elderly patients vulnerable to diseases. As USG Tom Fletcher said, we must return to the ceasefire. Madam President, Sierra Leone condemned at the first occasion the brutal acts of terror committed by Hamas and other armed groups against Israeli civilians on 7 October 2023. We affirm the prohibition of hostage-taking under international law and demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas since 7 October 2023. We are clear and unequivocal on this point, while noting and respecting the agreed arrangement for the release of Palestinian detainees endorsed by this Council. We therefore emphasize the necessity of sustained diplomatic engagement to consolidate the ceasefire agreement and address outstanding issues. A just and lasting solution to this crisis requires the full and immediate restoration of humanitarian aid access, respect for international law and accountability, the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and a political resolution based on the two-state solution, ensuring security and coexistence for both Israeli and Palestinians. This Council must remain steadfast in upholding its responsibility to maintain peace, security, and justice. The cost of inaction is too high, and the suffering of the people in Gaza, the occupied Palestinian territory, and Israel cannot and must not be ignored. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, thank you for organizing today's briefing, and my thanks as well to USG Fletcher for his sobering briefing. Madam President, Palestinians are observing another Ramadan marked by deprivation and renewed destruction. More than 400 of them were reportedly killed in the last 24 hours. It is ironic that in this holy month when Muslims across the world seek to grow in moral probity, Palestinians are confronted with more suffering brought about by an apparent paucity of humanity and compassion. The past 3 weeks have seen a rollback of the humanitarian progress made over the previous 6 weeks, following the ceasefire deal brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. With the pause of the Israeli offensive in Gaza and the easing of several restrictions on humanitarian assistance, Palestinians, and indeed the international community, were hopeful that the situation would progressively improve, culminating at some point in a full recovery for Gaza. Guyana is therefore very disappointed that a decision was taken to halt humanitarian aid into Gaza since March 2nd on account of a deadlock in the negotiations between Israel and Hamas. This decision is illegal, since Israel is obligated under international law not to deprive civilians of the goods and services essential for their survival. Guyana is first in the path of war, which has ravaged their lives and their land for over 15 months. Guyana calls on this Council to take the necessary action to prevent a repeat of the catastrophe which Gaza has endured for more than a year. Coupled with this new offensive, the ongoing aid blockade has placed Palestinians in an extremely precarious situation, as we have heard from USG Fletcher. Guyana calls on Israel to lift the ban on the entry of aid into Gaza, in keeping with its obligations under international humanitarian law. As asserted by the World Food Programme, and I quote, "Unimpeded humanitarian access is the only means of survival for many families," unquote. We therefore call for full respect for their right to life. We further call on Israel and Hamas to prioritize the lives and well-being of civilians and to urgently reach agreement on the next phase of the ceasefire deal and ultimately on a permanent ceasefire. We also call on Israel to halt airstrikes on Gaza, as these only strain the negotiating environment in addition to bringing more death and destruction. Madam President, as the largest gathering on women's empowerment and gender equality, the Commission on the Status of Women is currently meeting in New York, allow me to speak on the pained reports of the situation of women and girls in Palestine, both in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. We have taken note of the 13th March report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, on Israel's systematic use of sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence since 7 October 2023. The report has elaborated the disproportionate impact of the war on Palestinian women and girls, who continue to bear the brunt of the decisions taken by those in power. Civilian women and girls have been reportedly targeted directly. Women have died from complications related to pregnancy and childbirth because of restrictions imposed and conditions created by the war. Their access to adequate health care, including reproductive health care, have been severely curtailed. The combination of starvation, denial of humanitarian assistance, destruction of Gaza's healthcare system, and lack of access to water and sanitation has caused severe reproductive harms to women, impacting all aspects of reproduction, including pregnancy, childbirth, postpartum recovery, and lactation. Further, women and girls are enduring conditions that severely limit their ability to manage postpartum bleeding and menstruation hygienically and with dignity. The mantra of no one left behind rings hollow when Palestinian women and girls see their rights trampled upon daily, and the very basic of necessities for female hygiene, which many of us take for granted, such as sanitary napkins and water, become a luxury. Madam President, one of the most painful realizations is all of this is happening in the 21st century. With all the international legal advances made for the protection and promotion of the rights of women and girls, the situation in Palestine should never have reached these proportions. The situation of children is equally distressing, Madam President. As reported by UNICEF, without aid entering the Gaza Strip, roughly 1 million children are again living without the very basics they need to survive. Madam President, dear colleagues, the people in Gaza continue to suffer because of political decisions that they had no part in making. These decisions will be felt for years, even decades, by innocent people who will still be grappling with the socioeconomic, physical, and psychological impacts of this war, long after the guns have gone silent. In fact, this is a double tragedy, since the people of Israel will also continue to grapple with the consequences of a decades-old war that keeps pitting them against people who, just like themselves, dream of peace. Guyana's singular appeal to the parties is to prioritize peace for the people of Palestine and the people of Israel. In so doing, we reiterate the need for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire to create the conditions for the recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. Guyana again calls on Israel to lift its illegal blockade of aid into the Gaza Strip, to facilitate the easing of the dire humanitarian situation, and on the international community to scale up its humanitarian assistance. We also reiterate the demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages from Gaza and of Palestinian prisoners detained in Israeli jails without charge. Finally, Guyana calls for earnest efforts towards a lasting, just, and comprehensive peace between Israel and Palestine, premised on the two-state solution. Guyana remains committed to doing its part to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. Before I give the floor to the representative of France, I would like to announce our... Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm wrong here. So I now give the floor to the representative of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Undersecretary General Coordinator Fletcher, for your briefing. Madam President, colleagues, the blame for the resumption of hostilities lies solely with Hamas. This brutal terrorist organization has steadfastly refused every proposal and deadline they've been presented over the past few weeks, including a bridge proposal to extend the ceasefire beyond Ramadan and Passover, to allow time to negotiate a framework for a permanent ceasefire. Hamas refused this offer, preferring still to hold hostages captive and hide amongst the people of Gaza, using them as human shields. It is the people of Gaza who will suffer further because of Hamas's disregard for human life. Madam President, in this context, I want to respond to the allegation of indiscriminate attacks by the IDF. The IDF is striking Hamas positions. It is well known that Hamas continues to use civilian infrastructure as launching pads, and the United States condemns this practice, as should others. President Trump has made clear that Hamas must release the hostages immediately or pay a high price, and we support Israel in its next steps. Hamas must release the hostages it abducted more than 17 months ago. Doing so would enable loved ones to be reunited and allow the return of remains for those killed while being held by Hamas. Unfortunately, Hamas has refused all attempts to find a way to extend the ceasefire. It has been weeks since Hamas has released any hostages. We must recognize Hamas's savagery for what it is. This terrorist organization committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, raped and engaged in sexual violence toward Israeli hostages and other victims of the attack, released multiple hostages in a condition reminiscent of Holocaust survivors, and murdered and then paraded the coffins of the Bibas children through the streets. President Trump has been clear. All of the remaining 59 hostages, including New Jersey resident Idan Alexander and the bodies of 4 Americans murdered by Hamas, Itai Chen, Gadi Hagai, Judy Weinstein Hagai, and Omer Nutra, must be immediately released. Behind every terrorist group like Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, behind every act of violence, behind everything that threatens peace and stability for the millions of people who call this region home, is Iran. The countries of the Middle East have an historic opportunity to reshape their region in a way that affords all its people a better path forward. Stronger ties between Israel and its neighbors offer an alternative to Iran's malign influence and state sponsorship of terror. The United States will do its part with our Arab partners to work toward a durable solution to the conflict and create a more prosperous future for the region's people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. And I will now try again to welcome our new colleague, Ambassador Jérôme Bonafont, who's the new permanent representative of France to the Security Council. We look forward to working together. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for your words of welcome. I'll try to be as good as Nicolas de Rivière, my predecessor. He told me that he very much appreciated his work in the Council and the cooperation with members. We would like to thank the coordinator for his briefing, and we'd like to thank all humanitarian actors working to help the population affected by the humanitarian situation. Madam President, Tom Fletcher said this, the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, it has once again become disastrous. Nothing can be added to this description. We hope that we won't have to say this again. Well, we hope that, but reality now means that we have to. France condemns the Israeli strikes carried out yesterday in the Gaza Strip that have already led to hundreds of civilian victims. We call for an immediate end to hostilities, which compromises the efforts to release the hostages and threatens the lives of the civilian population in Gaza. All parties must respect the ceasefire comprehensively and engage in good faith negotiations in order to make the ceasefire permanent and continue with the January agreement. We call upon the Israeli authorities to ensure the permanent protection of all civilians and to re-establish access to water and electricity, as well as to immediately lift obstacles to the entry of humanitarian aid in Gaza. We reiterate our call for the unconditional release of all hostages still detained in Gaza. France also expresses its concern with regard to the situation for the civilians in the West Bank, particularly forced displacement. We call upon the Israeli authorities to show the greatest restraint in the use of force and to ensure, according to international humanitarian law, the protection of the civilian population and enable the rapid return to those civilians that have been displaced. International humanitarian law must fully apply. We welcome the work of the agencies, funds and programs of the United Nations, including UNRWA, in assisting the population. Madam President, it is imperative that all of the hostages be released without condition in accordance with international law and what this Council has so many times demanded. Hamas must put an end to the degrading and humiliating treatment inflicted on the hostages. And France continues to stand in solidarity with the hostages and the Israeli people in the face of the trauma they have suffered. We will always condemn the terrorist, barbarous attacks committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October 2023, which constitute the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Shoah. We will never cease to condemn the sexual violence committed by these terrorist groups. The Council must do the same. France welcomes the tireless efforts of the United States, Qatar, and Egypt in facilitating negotiations for continuing the ceasefire and the release of hostages. I referred to this previously. Hostilities in Gaza must end and lead to lasting peace. France welcomes the proposal for Gaza reconstruction put forward by the member states of the Arab League at the Cairo summit on the 4th of March last, and we would call upon all parties to build on the strengths of this plan in order to progress, particularly in the area of security and governance. This plan must exclude Hamas from governance in Gaza. The movement must be disarmed and it must provide solid security guarantees to Israel. The future of Gaza must go hand in hand with a global political resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it is with this goal in mind that France in June 2025 will co-chair with Saudi Arabia an international conference on the implementation of the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, here in New York. This is the only path that will allow Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security. But for the moment, what is urgent is to stop the bombing, resume humanitarian aid and to in dignity all of the hostages. I thank you.
The representative of France for the statement. And now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for convening this meeting. And thanks to Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, OCHA, for his detailed report. This meeting is being held in a context of profound concern, given the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip following the recent restrictions on the entry of humanitarian assistance. We deeply regret the worsening of the always sensitive ceasefire that had provided temporary relief to the civilian population. It's urgent now that efforts be resumed, all necessary efforts to restore calm and enable safe access of assistance to those that need it so much. Since the 1st of March, the closure of the border crossings has prevented the entry of humanitarian assistance, leading to serious scarcity of food, medicines and fuel. This has endangered thousands of people who for so long have depended on humanitarian assistance to survive, in particular during this period of the holy month of Ramadan, which should be a time of peace and reflection. As indicated by the World Food Programme, In the 42 days of the ceasefire, it was possible to deliver more than 40,000 metric tons of food to Gaza, providing vital assistance to 1.3 million people. Nevertheless, since the recent closure of the crossings, it has not been possible to deliver new assistance. The suspension of the electrical supply, according to OCHA, has further worsened the situation. The disconnection of the desalination plant in the south of Gaza has drastically reduced access to drinking water, affecting some 600,000 people in various communities in the Strip, which seriously endangers public health and humanitarian security. In the midst of this crisis, it's fundamental to recognize the tireless work of the humanitarian actors who are working in extreme conditions to alleviate the suffering of the population. Panama very much appreciates the hard humanitarian work that is being done that has been done and made it possible to vaccinate more than 603,000 children against polio during the truce, thanks to the joint work of the WHO, UNRWA, and UNICEF. This effort demonstrates that when safe access is guaranteed, it is possible to protect the lives of the most vulnerable. That is why it is fundamental that measures be renewed that will facilitate the entry of supplies in a safe and sustainable manner. Madam President, it is important to recall that this crisis is not only the result of control and security measures that make it difficult to provide humanitarian access. The suffering and destruction that we see in Gaza is the direct consequence of the extremist actions of Hamas and their inhumane attack on the 7th of October, which unleashed this tragic spiral of violence. To that, we have to now add the current refusal of Hamas to meet the commitments agreed upon in the framework of the ceasefire and to release additional hostages. This has endangered thousands of innocent civilian lives. Hamas has not only sown terror, but it has exploited the suffering of the population of Gaza as a political bargaining chip. Panama has categorically condemned, and we do condemn this behavior, and we demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages that remain in their power. Madam President, on the other hand, looking at this painful reality, Panama would also like to stress that any sustainable solution must be guided by unconditional support for human dignity and the moral imperative of protecting civilians. We cannot allow innocent people to continue to pay the price for this tragedy. The time has come for the parties to act showing human sensitivity and constructive political will. This is what is needed in order to avoid further suffering and in order to save more lives. Any initiative must be rooted in the deepest empathy and the most genuine compassion. It's not just an issue of providing and distributing food and medicines. It is extending a hand to the efforts that are necessary to ensure that a hand can be extended to those that are clinging on to life, restoring their hope so that they can believe that a better tomorrow is possible. Panama appreciates the diplomatic efforts underway and that should continue in order to restore the ceasefire, which unfortunately was interrupted, and this is further worsening the suffering of the civilian population. These efforts must be resumed and intensified in order to ensure the continuity of the agreements that led to the ceasefire, which now unfortunately has been interrupted. And all facets of the agreement must be implemented fully. Dialogue and mediation must be resumed in order to guarantee the full and immediate and unconditional release of the hostages and safe and uninterrupted access to humanitarian assistance. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We would like to thank the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Tom Fletcher. Thank him for a detailed briefing on the current situation in Gaza, which is a man-made human catastrophe. When the delegation of Algeria and Somalia has asked for the briefing today so as to discuss the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza, they probably could not have thought that on the eve of a meeting the situation will worsen even further and all ceasefire agreements will basically have come to naught. In the evening on the 18th of March, the Israeli aviation resumed airstrikes against Gaza, which resulted in new victims. We have information of more than 400 people dead, and that the IDF is preparing for a land operation in the Strip. This way, the ceasefire regime was violated, and the tragedy of Palestinian civilians have taken on a new dimension. This tragedy is unfolding in front of our very eyes for a year and a half. And in the course of the military operation by Israel, there's basically nothing left of the Strip except for the smoldering ruins. And the number of Gaza civilians who have died is more than 48,000. The humanitarian crisis in the Strip has become truly biblical in nature, and this is supported by the assessments today of the UN humanitarians. The hospitals and basically the basic infrastructure is destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza are surviving out in the open, out in the street amongst rubble. There's an acute shortage of food. There is no sanitation and the absence of basic goods. At the same time, the people who are in desperation have no idea what tomorrow will bring, whether the military activities will stop or someone is going to rebuild their houses and how their children are going to survive. Those issues today, unfortunately, are sounding even more urgently because what is being done by Israel has thrown us back into uncertainty. And this is covering not only the Palestinians, but also those who are waiting for hostages to come back to Israel. The Association of 7 Hostages families stated today that the Israeli government had decided to sacrifice them and undermine the very process that should have resulted in their return. Instead of that, what we're seeing is the logic of edging the Gaza people out of their land has prevailed. And this is at the time when all of the suffering, which is beyond human comprehension, the people in Gaza, as we know from many sources, do not want to leave, and they only see their future as a future on their homeland. This is the right that they have suffered for, and the duty of the international community is to make sure that everything is done, that this right is implemented. They have to get a chance for a safe and dignified future in the Strip, and the Palestinian people as a whole a chance for creating their state. Madam President, distinguished colleagues, under the current circumstances, the Security Council has to do everything possible to make sure that there is a resumption of ceasefire as quickly as possible and that there is a resumption of the implementation of the agreement between Israel and Hamas. We should not repeat the mistakes of before. The number of Gazans died over the recent time is so high because the Security Council was unable to make an earlier decision on a ceasefire. And this is a very bitter lesson that the Security Council members should learn and not repeat, because no political considerations can justify such a delay which resulted in the lives lost for such a high number of people. Since from 19th January to the 2nd of March, when the agreements between Israel and Hamas took into force, the people of Gaza saw a glimmer of hope because the access was unblocked, there was greater humanitarian activity, and the UN system bodies reported of greater supplies and the window of opportunity, despite the fact that there were low chance for further deals implementation. Unfortunately, this glimmer of hope went out as quickly as it appeared. West Jerusalem once again tightened the screws, and for 2 weeks now, the people in Gaza have been facing a blockade, and there are no prospects for it being lifted. Today, the blockade has become even more inhumane. The authorities of Israel are obstructing the work of international humanitarian organizations and agencies. They prohibit any humanitarian supplies and commercial goods coming in, and they're dooming the people in Gaza to further suffering. As far as we can say, the crossings have been closed altogether today. Cutting off the power on the 9th of March from the desalination plant, and my colleagues mentioned that, is yet another instance of a blatant disregard to international humanitarian law on the part of West Jerusalem. This decision, by the way, is of no military import, but it brings hundreds of thousands of people to the brink of death because they have no access to clean drinking water. Give it some thought, please. Today, only 1 out of every 10 people in the Strip can have access to clean drinking water. The consequences of such a situation will be catastrophic, inter alia, because under these conditions there's a great risk of widespread infectious diseases. On the other hand, providing medical assistance, as we can see, are basically absent in the Strip. Madam President. And the most serious concern is caused by a continued crisis with UNRWA. The open prosecution of the agency, the Knesset decision to ban its functioning on what's being called the sovereign territory of Israel, only adds to the picture of an intentional undermining of the humanitarian response in this Strip. It's impossible to argue with how important UNRWA is for the refugees, nor can one deny that this is the UN body that's playing an irreplaceable role in providing assistance to the people in Gaza. We once again state with our unflagging support for UNRWA and recall the role the agency played in Middle East settlement, including dealing with one of the final status issues, namely the Palestinian refugees. Against this background, we hear from Israel the statement that they have some kind of a plan whereby Western Jerusalem would take full control over the supply and distribution of humanitarian assistance. There are very few details on this plan, but there is every reason to think that this plan, in case it's implemented, will not just seriously limit the operational possibilities for international bodies in Gaza, but also will undermine the 2720 mechanism which was created under a Security Council decision. It is also clear that such a plan cannot replace a large-scale UN humanitarian assistance. The situation is further compounded by the fact that Israel, as an occupying power, is refusing to shoulder the responsibility for providing the needs of the people under occupation. We can see that such notions of the care for the people or protection of civilians are not among the principles and the methods used by the IDF in their military operations, where they used heavy weaponry in the Strip and in the West Bank. And the West Bank situation is something that we are going to discuss this Friday. The humanitarian bodies of the UN have shown that they can, especially if there's a ceasefire, conduct effective work in the Strip and save people's lives. They need to be supported as much as we can and protect humanitarians from persecution on behalf of West Jerusalem, and this is purely political in nature. The suffering on people should not be used as a weapon of war, blackmail, or a lever of exerting influence on Hamas and the international community as a whole, and yet this is exactly what's happening. Madam President, we strongly condemn the measures introduced by Israel and think that their use is a key obstacle on the road towards easing the suffering of 2 million people in Gaza. And we call on the Israeli authorities to immediately lift the restrictions and to end the restrictions on humanitarian action in the entire OPT, including the Strip and the West Bank. We reiterate our consistent and constant for a ceasefire, the release of all hostages and detainees, ensuring there's unimpeded humanitarian access to the OPT, and their return to the peace process on the basis of the two states for the two peoples formula. We are convinced that without a just and lasting settlement ensuring the legitimate rights and aspirations of Palestinians to have their own state within 1967 border with a capital in East Jerusalem, without that, a vicious circle of bloodshed and violence in the Middle East will not be broken. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank Under-Secretary General Fletcher for his briefing. I also want to thank him for his efforts, and I want to thank and recognize sacrifices made by the humanitarian workers in Gaza and the region. You are doing everything you can. I would like to make 4 points. First, in conflicts, we as Slovenia don't take sides. We stand with peace, protection of civilians, and international law. We entered the Security Council with an idealistic aim of helping extending the zones of peace, protecting civilians, and promoting respect for the international law. And yet it seems so difficult to work for peace. It seems so difficult for warring parties to surrender to peace. Today, Israel resumed hostilities, setting in motion a new wave of strikes and evacuation orders. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed just today, and 2 million of them are facing a new cycle of hardship, destruction, and relentless fear. We condemn these attacks and we call on Israel to stop them immediately. Second, Slovenia has been supporting calls for the ceasefire time and again, and we continue calling on the parties to return to the agreement made with the support of mediators and guarantors, the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, in line with the Council Resolution 2735. 6 weeks of ceasefire has offered a much-needed relief to the people in Gaza and to the people of Israel, finally reuniting them with hostages. The Council should now be focusing on discussing the plans of rebuilding of basic infrastructure and reconstruction, in line with the vision provided by our Arab partners. This should be the time we launch a process leading to two-state solutions. Instead, we are back to pleading for sparing lives of civilians, Palestinians and hostages, and for allowing food and water deliveries to Gaza. This is wrong in so many levels. Humanitarian aid and access to basic goods and services, including electricity, cannot be politicized. International law is clear and it must be respected. Crossings to Gaza must be opened. Aid must flow in, and humanitarian operations must run unimpeded. Third, we want to express our extreme concern over the information of plans related to humanitarian space, humanitarian bubbles, or whatever euphemism one likes. We also underline our strong rejection of any plans for a settlement of Palestinians. Fourth, it is roughly a year from the ICJ binding order on provisional measures focused on humanitarian aid, famine and starvation in the case brought forward by South Africa. It is unacceptable that our conversations are still the same and that Council resolutions and ICJ orders are disregarded. Madam President, to conclude and to summarize, the resumed killing and destructions must end. Aid is not negotiable. It should not be weaponized. We denounce these actions, just as we denounce hostage-taking by Hamas. In Gaza, both Palestinians and hostages are being sacrificed. This vile war should not continue being fought on the shoulders of civilians. This is not only tragic for Palestinians and hostages in Gaza, but also for the credibility and relevance of the Security Council as the body responsible for maintenance of international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, USG Fletcher, for your sobering briefing. I also want to thank Algeria and Somalia for calling this meeting, an initiative which the UK fully supports, considering the alarming humanitarian situation. President, this meeting comes at a critical moment. As my Foreign Secretary has said, the civilian casualties from Israeli strikes overnight are appalling. I want to be clear. A return to fighting will only result in the deaths of more Palestinian civilians, Israeli hostages, and IDF soldiers. This conflict cannot be resolved through military means. We want to see the ceasefire re-established as soon as possible. The humanitarian situation in Gaza was already catastrophic. After 17 days, Israel continues to block all aid entering Gaza. Crossing points have been shut off. Bakeries are closing. Hospitals and desalination plants are running on generators that could stop at any moment. This is horrifying and unacceptable. Humanitarian aid should never be used as a political tool. We are calling for the following urgent steps to bring this terrifying situation back from the brink. First, we call for the protection of civilians and for safe, rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access. We call on Israel to fulfill its international obligations and allow for a rapid and unhindered resurgence in the flow of aid. This includes the supply of items such as medical equipment, shelter items, and water and sanitation equipment, essential to meet humanitarian and early recovery needs in Gaza, but which remain restricted. Failure to deliver this not only risks undoing the vital humanitarian progress made during Phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement, it also risks violating international humanitarian law. Second, we urge all parties to return urgently to dialogue and to implement the ceasefire agreement in full, including scaling up aid and releasing the 59 hostages who've been cruelly held by Hamas for over 500 days and have endured unimaginable suffering. For Israel to be secure, these terrorists can have no role in Gaza's future. But cutting off aid and resuming the fighting is not a means to this end. Finally, we reiterate that civilians of Gaza who've suffered so much must be allowed to return to their homes and rebuild their lives. Colleagues, we urge all parties to return to the ceasefire deal and get back to the path of peace. A negotiated two-state solution is the best way to ensure long-term security for both Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President, for responding to this urgent meeting request, and to USG Tom Fletcher for his sobering briefing. Colleagues, Middle East currently stands at a turning point, and the long-awaited ceasefire and hostage release agreement in Gaza was a great example of what could be achieved through political will. We are seriously alarmed by the resumption of hostilities in Gaza and the new huge death toll, and we call on all parties to show restraint and resume the ceasefire talks. Following the profound shock of October 7, 2023, Greece maintained a principled stance. We express our condemnation of Hamas terrorist attack and the ongoing detention and cruel treatment of the hostages, and we reiterated our demand for the immediate and unconditional release. The people of Gaza have endured a second winter under extremely difficult circumstances. Tom Fletcher today and other briefers who have preceded him in this Council have tried to describe living conditions almost beyond our comprehension. We echo the calls of humanitarian aid to flow back to Gaza immediately and the crossings to open as soon as possible. Reports by OCHA and the World Food Programme of the inability to transport food supplies into Gaza due to the closure of all border crossing points is of utmost concern. The suffering of the civilian population must come to an end. We call on Israel to allow and facilitate the safe, unconditional, massive and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid at scale and restore access to electricity and water, as well as to ensure the protection of civilians and other protected persons, including humanitarian workers, in line with international humanitarian law. Millions are in urgent need of primary health services, education and shelter, as Gaza territory has been reduced to rubble. Thousands of children were left dead, injured, separated from their families and internally displaced. Hence, the unhindered and continuous flow of aid into all parts of Gaza should remain a priority. UNRWA's role remains pivotal and indispensable.
We support all efforts to ensure that humanitarian aid reaches Gaza and have consistently supported the Cypriot-Amalthea Maritime Corridor and other initiatives in this regard. Within the EU, we took an initiative so that EU member states can assume the treatment of injured and sick children from Gaza. In this context, we welcome 10 children and their families from Gaza who are currently receiving treatment in Greek hospitals. OCHA warnings of increased settler violence across the West Bank is also alarming, as is the displacement of people, the unfolding security situation in Jenin following the intensification of operations and terrorist attacks in the West Bank. Madam President, we need a permanent ceasefire that can pave the way for the release of all remaining hostages and for the reconstruction of Gaza. In this vein, we welcome regional efforts to cohere and arm the single plan for the next phase in Gaza, and we stand ready to support and develop these ideas further. The Arab plan put forth by Egypt is a constructive proposal on the table. We are clear that any plan must not have no role for Hamas, must ensure Israel's security, must not displace Palestinians from Gaza. Any scenario of displacements would jeopardize regional stability and security, and it would undermine the prospect of achieving the two-state solution. Reconstruction efforts should also include governance and security arrangements, while ensuring the leading role of an empowered and informed Palestinian Authority in this process, capable of exerting effective governance over the West Bank and Gaza. It should also be ensured that Hamas will be excluded for any planning on the day after in Gaza, and that it will never pose a threat to Israel's security. For this to happen, though, the Palestinian Authority needs to be supported financially and institutionally, and Greece remains committed to providing assistance in this direction. Madam President, the political process must remain as a core objective of our collective efforts. We support the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state on the basis of the two-state solution, according to the relevant Security Council resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Pakistan.
I thank you, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our new colleague from France. And we thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher for his very sobering briefing on the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. Madam President, we are at another tragic milestone in the war in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. This war and the manner in which the Security Council and the international community respond to the atrocities and actions that have been taken will have a lasting impact on the nature of the world order which we and succeeding generations inherit. 50,000 plus people have been killed in Gaza, 150,000 injured, and 2/3 of them have been women and children. Attacks on hospitals, schools, mosques, civilian centers. Every principle, every article of international law and international humanitarian law have been blatantly violated with impunity. Defying the resolutions of the General Assembly, of the Security Council, of the International Court of Justice. Unless the international community responds with justice to what has happened and is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories, our world order is likely to regress into the barbarism from which the Charter of the United Nations was supposed to rescue us. Madam President, the agreement of 15th January for a ceasefire, for a three-phase ceasefire, offered a sliver of hope for the Palestinian people, for the Israeli people, and for the world community. Phase one of that agreement was implemented, and serious consideration was continuing for the negotiation, elaboration, and implementation of phase 2 and 3 of the agreement as outlined in Resolution 2735 of the Security Council. The Arab and OIC Reconstruction and Peace Plan was under consideration in capitals. It offered a road to peace. But obviously, this glimmer of hope and hope for peace was not to the liking of the extremist leaders who rule Israel today. They see their survival in the continuation of the war. But is this in the interest of the hostages? Is this in the interest of the Israeli people? Is this in the interest of the Palestinians? And is this in the interest of world order? I think the answer is obvious. The first tactic to erode the ceasefire agreement was the imposition of the humanitarian blockade, an attempt to extort concessions beyond the ceasefire agreement of 15th of January. Blocking trucks, cutting off electricity and water, restricting NGOs, preventing access for Muslims to access the Holy Al-Aqsa Mosque during the holy month of Ramadan. These are all tactics of the oppressor. And now they have escalated to blatantly violate the ceasefire and resume attacks against the helpless Palestinians in Gaza who were just returning to rebuild their homes. 400, mostly women and children were killed just last night. And if this bombing and artillery attacks continue, hundreds more may be dying as we speak. The Security Council's response must be clear, must be quick, and must be just. Firstly, we must demand a halt to the Israeli attacks in Gaza and the implementation of Resolution 2735. I would like to add that even if there are military targets in civilian facilities, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, there is a prohibition to attacking such targets, even if there are military targets within those civilian facilities. It is a clear injunction of international humanitarian law and cannot be offered as an excuse for the killing of civilians, innocent men, women, and children. Secondly, we hope and ask that the negotiations on Phase 2 and Phase 3 of the ceasefire agreement reflected in Resolution 2735 must be resumed. We call for full implementation of all phases of the Gaza ceasefire: hostilities, return of displaced persons to their homes, withdrawal of Israeli forces, opening all crossings, adequate humanitarian access to all parts of the Gaza Strip, and a comprehensive reconstruction plan for Gaza. 3, humanitarian assistance must be immediately resumed, and the restrictions that have been imposed must be lifted. According to Amnesty International, Israel's, and I quote, Israel's decision to block humanitarian aid to Gaza is a war crime and amounts to collective punishment of the civilian population. It's a continuation of the policy to impose on Palestinians conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. This is genocide, unquote. Madam President, we demand that adequate funding should be provided for coordinated efforts that are crucial to enable OCHA's 2025 flash appeal for the occupied Palestinian territories to be funded. Donor contributions today are only 173 million of a 4 billion that is required. And UNRWA's unparalleled capacity to deliver emergency, shelter, food, and medical assistance is irreplaceable and must be allowed to operate without obstruction. Fourthly, Madam President, the Israeli aggression in the West Bank must end. Forced displacements, illegal land annexations, and settler violence must be reversed in accordance with Security Council resolutions 2720 and 2334. Finally, Madam President, we must ensure the revival of a credible and irreversible political process towards a two-state solution and the establishment of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state within the pre-67 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. This is the only viable path to durable peace. The upcoming June conference, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, is an important opportunity for the peaceful resolution of the Palestinian question and the implementation of the two-state solution. But, Madam President, to realize the possibility of peace, Israel's aggression, its attacks, and its slaughter of the Palestinians must stop. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank USG Tom Fletcher for his detailed briefing on the dismal humanitarian situation in Gaza. Madam President, we are gravely alarmed by Israel's renewed offensive in Gaza, causing hundreds of fatalities, including scores of children today alone. We are also seriously concerned over the precarious fate of the hard-won agreement for ceasefire and release of hostages, as well as the quickly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. As repeatedly stressed by the members of the Security Council, it is clearly Israel's illegal obligation under international humanitarian law to allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, including 1 million children. Hostage-taking by Hamas is unacceptable under any circumstances. It must be condemned by all members of the Council. And we repeat our demand that all hostages be released immediately and unconditionally. However, Hamas' refusal to carry out its obligation does not justify blocking humanitarian aid or using it as a bargaining chip, which is unacceptable and strictly prohibited under international law. Neither does it justify the resumption of an intensive military offensive, causing massive civilian casualties. We take note of the horrifying remarks by USG Tom Fletcher during his press briefing last Wednesday, sharing what he witnessed in Gaza in January. And I quote, "I said to my colleagues, why are the dogs so fast? Why are the dogs so fat?" And he said, "Because the dogs are looking for curbs." And you notice that the people are thin for miles and miles and miles, unquote. During the implementation of the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, we witnessed the crucial impact of political will in easing the immense suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. However, once again today, we are seeing and feeling with shock and concern a grim sense of déjà vu in relation to the unfathomable sufferings, insecurity, destruction, and hunger that has haunted civilians in Gaza for more than a year. Madam President, the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th and Israel's massive military operations resulting in extreme anguish highlight once again the imperative to move toward a just and long-lasting solution to the conflicts between Israel and Palestine. A sober approach based on the acknowledgement of the legitimate rights and concern of both Israelis and Palestinians is the only option for durable peace and stability in the region. We call on Israel to immediately cease the offensive and all parties return to the negotiating table. We hope the mediating countries, including the US, Qatar, and Egypt, exert utmost effort to secure the ceasefire and the release of hostages. We believe that all phases of the ceasefire agreement endorsed by the Council through Resolution 2735 should be implemented in full, leading to the release of all hostages, a permanent end of hostilities, and the swift beginning of reconstruction based on international law. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank Algeria and Somalia for calling today's meeting, and thank USG Fletcher for the briefing. I also welcome the new PR of France. With the implementation of the ceasefire on January 19, people in Gaza had a long-awaited respite, and the humanitarian disaster was relieved to some extent. However, as the first phase of the ceasefire expired on March 1st, the ceasefire agreement failed to enter the second phase. In spite of the strong calls from the international community to extend the Gaza ceasefire and the strong desire of the Gaza population for the resumption of peace and tranquility, the situation has moved in opposite direction. On March 2nd, Israel announced the decision to halt the entry of humanitarian aid to Gaza. On March 9th, it cut off the supply of power to Gaza. Just yesterday, Israel launched large-scale airstrikes on Gaza, causing hundreds of civilian casualties. China regrets the harm done to the hard-won ceasefire and is gravely concerned about Israel's resumption of hostilities in Gaza. We strongly condemn this. We strongly urge the abandonment of the force logic of supremacy of force. Military means is not the way to solve the Palestine-Israel question. The stark contrast between 15 months of bloody conflict and 42 days of ceasefire clearly shows that indiscriminate use of force is not the right way to bring back hostages, and may even put them at greater risks. China urges Israel to renounce its obsession with the use of force, immediately cease military operations in Gaza, and stop the collective punishment of the Gazan civilians. We strongly demand a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The ceasefire agreement was reached. As such, it should be fully and seriously implemented in good faith, and no attempt should be made to alter or undermine it midway. China calls on the parties to implement the ceasefire agreement fully and continuously, and expects the ceasefire guarantors to adopt a fair and responsible approach to facilitate the continuous implementation of the three-phase agreement and ensure the realization of a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We strongly oppose the weaponization and politicization of humanitarian aid. As of today, for 70 consecutive days, no humanitarian supplies were allowed into Gaza, and the loss of power disabled a desalinization plant, worsening the water shortage crisis. The use of humanitarian aid as a bargaining chip is a violation of international law, especially international humanitarian law. China condemns such practice. We urge Israel to fulfill its obligations as occupier under international humanitarian law and immediately restore full humanitarian access to Gaza. We strongly call for the reinvigoration of the political prospects of the two-state solution. The implementation of the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the question of Palestine. Gaza and the Western Bank, including East Jerusalem, are all inseparable parts of the Palestinian state. We support the Gaza Recovery and Reconstruction Plan jointly initiated by Egypt and other Arab states, and support an early launch of reconstruction underpinned by the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine, whereby the Palestinian people can rebuild their homes in their own territory. The international community should step up its efforts to advance the political process of the two-state solution and provide necessary support to this end. President, for some time now, we have witnessed a dangerous sign in the Middle East. As the international rule of law and international order are violated and undermined, the law of the jungle seems to reign. It is worrisome and a cause for concern. The Security Council, as the primary body for maintaining international peace and security, should put a timely end to such chaos. We support further actions by the Council to bring about a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, restore peace in the Middle East, and achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the Palestinian question. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Denmark. And I would like to join to colleagues in thanking Undersecretary Fletcher for his sobering briefing and his very detailed description of the many achievements achieved during the ceasefire. At the outset, let me express Denmark's shock and sadness over the news coming from Gaza about the many civilian casualties following the Israeli airstrikes last night. Let me be clear. This violence must stop, and the terms of the ceasefire must be respected. A ceasefire that can pave the way for the release of all remaining hostages and ensure much-needed humanitarian aid to the civilians of Gaza. We urge all parties to show restraint. Denmark has repeatedly underlined the need to ensure the protection of civilians in line with international humanitarian law. We reiterate this call today. Colleagues, as we've heard several times this morning, the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains catastrophic. The recent Israeli decision to block all further humanitarian assistance and to cut electricity to the enclave is rendering the situation even more desperate and threatens to reverse progress made during the first phase of the ceasefire. The consequences are already starting to emerge. The lack of supplies has meant that humanitarian partners are reducing food rations. UNICEF reports that roughly 1 million children in Gaza are now once again living without basic necessities for survival. The recent resumption of hostilities will only worsen this suffering. Denmark continues to condemn Hamas' terror attack of October 7 and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. The safety and well-being of these hostages is of great concern, and we regret that Hamas has failed to allow humanitarian access to them. Colleagues, international humanitarian law is clear. Humanitarian aid should never be used as a bargaining chip or a political tool. This applies to all parties in a conflict. As the occupying power, Israel is obliged under international law to ensure the protection of civilians and ensure the civilian population does not lack food or other basic needs, including water. Civilians of Gaza have suffered enough. The sustained supply of aid is indispensable to the survival of over 2 million Palestinians. They have the right to receive humanitarian aid. They have the right to clean water, to food, to medicine. We call on the government of Israel to abide by its obligations under international law, to ensure full, rapid, safe and unhindered provisions of humanitarian assistance to the population in Gaza, and to ensure the protection of civilians and other protected persons, including humanitarian workers, in line with international humanitarian law. The immediate threat of malnutrition in Gaza is already affecting thousands of children and pregnant and breastfeeding women. The decisions to withhold humanitarian aid and limit the production of clean drinking water are likely to have long-term consequences for the health of Gaza's population, as well as longer-term prospects for socio-economic recovery. Colleagues, the massive task of reconstructing Gaza lies before us. We need a permanent ceasefire as a first step to be able to address this challenge. We call on parties to find a way forward to the next phases of the ceasefire agreement that should hopefully lead to a permanent ceasefire. We commend the regional efforts through the Arab Recovery and Reconstruction Plan presented at the recent Cairo summit. We maintain that any plan for the future of Gaza must have no role for Hamas, must ensure Israeli security, and must not displace Palestinians from Gaza. In closing, the civilian population in Gaza have already endured too much suffering for far too long. They are looking to this Council for support. Around this table, we have a responsibility to act, to urgently work towards a two-state solution, the only viable path to lasting peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Let me reiterate Denmark's unwavering commitment to this goal. And I now resume my functions as President of the Council. I give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, allow me at the outset to thank you for the convening of this urgent meeting at this critical time, and to thank Algeria and Somalia for requesting it on behalf of the Arab group, as well as China, France, Guyana, Pakistan, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom for their support to this request. Allow me also to thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher, who has recently visited Gaza and the region, for his relentless efforts and for his sobering and alarming briefing. Madam President, this meeting was originally requested to discuss Israel's weaponization of humanitarian aid for collective punishment purposes, with Israeli leaders confessing to it publicly. They're not denying it or claiming, as they have done in the past, that hundreds and sometimes thousands of truckloads of humanitarian aid is in Gaza Strip. This time now, they made the decision to weaponize it, to use it, to stop it publicly. They're not denying it. No longer feeling the need to even keep up pretenses. We were supposed to gather here to discuss how an entire civilian population who had survived a genocide and with still immense needs was yet again confronted with fuel and electricity being cut off, leading to the shutdown of essential water and sewage treatment facilities, worsening the already dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza, so-called evacuation orders to advance, forcible displacement, and all this coupled with the hermetic siege denying the entire civilian Palestinian population life-saving aid since the beginning of the month. Now, we gather here after a series of deadly Israeli attacks that killed last night alone hundreds of Palestinians. Current reports indicating over 400 killed and nearly 600 injured in the span of few hours during the night last night, reminiscent of the criminal bombardments our people endured for over 15 months. The same images are back to haunt us. Small children on Garnia's little siblings, injured and disoriented, trying to comfort and reassure each other. Entire families killed, children, mothers, fathers, searching for their loved ones under the rubble, not knowing if they are dead or alive. Bombardments, death, devastation, fire, and fear are yet again spreading throughout the Gaza Strip. And this is all happening during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, 1 year after the councils chose this same period, given its significance, to call for the first time for a ceasefire to hold the genocide and stem unimaginable human suffering. In our tradition, nobody would fight during the month of Ramadan. This is from the beginning of time. But yet, the criminals, cruel, selfish leaders of the government of Israel, of the occupying authorities, do these things in spite of traditions and respect for religion and humanity. Madam President, Palestinians are being killed indiscriminately, are being denied humanitarian aid indiscriminately, are being maimed and detained indiscriminately. We condemn these crimes in the strongest possible terms. This can never be justified and must stop immediately. Must stop immediately. And I agree with you, Madam President, when you said that you have a responsibility around the table to act. You are the Security Council. Act. Stop this criminal action. Stop them from denying our people food in the month of Ramadan and water and the hospitals to operate. Act. You have resolutions. Act. You have power. Act. Or, as my friend, the ambassador of Slovenia said, you become irrelevant. Act according to the power given to you by the Charter of the United Nations. Madam President, ceasefire works. It is the only thing that does. It stopped the bloodshed. It allowed the entry of humanitarian aid Israel had long denied. It allowed the release of hostages and prisoners. It allowed for the starving people to be given sustenance, for the sick and wounded to receive medical care, as the tenets of international humanitarian law and our very humanity oblige. Life was starting to triumph over death. Our collective role is to ensure life prevails, and that requires ensuring the full and effective implementation of Resolution 2735. Resolution 2735 is unequivocal. It clearly spells out the terms of each phase and the obligations of each side. It also clearly states in relations to Phase 2, which includes release of hostages and full withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from Gaza, that the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations continue. And negotiations will keep going until all the agreements are reached and Phase 2 is able to begin. There should not be unilateral, self-serving, and irresponsible decisions to execute breaking the ceasefire. While the Trump administration has prioritized the release of hostages, it is evident that Netanyahu's concern for his political selfish survival far outweighs his concern for the survival of the hostages. Madam President, the resolution is also clear in rejecting any attempt at demographic or territorial change in the Gaza Strip, including any actions that reduce the territory of Gaza, a goal Israel continues to pursue as mass forcible displacement and annexation remain its primary aims throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. The resolution also reiterates the Council's unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders, consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions, and stresses the importance of unifying the Gaza Strip with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. This is the only way forward. This is the only way forward. Sustaining the ceasefire, implementing it in full, and transforming it into a clear and immediate pathway to Palestinian independence and ceasefire for all. Act now. You can act, not to allow the ceasefire to be broken, not to allow the starvation of the Palestinian people. Act now. Madam President, the State of Palestine and Arab countries, with the support of many around the world, have exerted every effort to ensure that Gaza in particular and Palestine as a whole are set on a different trajectory towards life and liberty, to change the reality our people has been for too long endured, and to change forever and for the better our region, for the benefit of all states and all peoples. A clear vision accompanied with a solid plan was endorsed by the Arab Summit and supported by the OIC ministerial meeting and has been welcomed worldwide, and many of you in your statements referred to your support to what was adopted in the Arab Summit conference. A small ray of hope was appearing on the dawn of the possibility of changing the tragedy in the Middle East to something that is different and promising. And perhaps that's why the criminal extremist leaders of Israel who do not want to allow this ray of possibility to flourish, they did what they did last night in order to destroy the efforts of all of us to open the door of peace. They are trying to close that door and to open the door of war and destruction and killing people. These efforts should be supported. The efforts of the Arabs, the OIC, and all of you that you've referred to should be supported, not compromised and sabotaged. They offer the only viable path away from conflict and towards peace. They have transformative power. Allow them to flourish. Allow them to become the new reality. Don't allow the other option of war and destruction and taking away lives, especially of children and women. Peace saves lives. War takes lives. Act. Choose peace. We, Palestine and Arab countries, are acting responsibly and with resolve to end this conflict once and for all. We are acting responsibly and with resolve to end this conflict once and for all. We will spare no effort, and we need all the help we can get. Help us. Act. We want peace. We have a plan. We have an alternative. We have options. It is crystal clear. Help us. Act with us to make peace is the option of the world, and make war not acceptable and need to be stopped, and ceasefire to prevail. This starts with supporting the Arab plan for reconstruction, which many of you refer to, supporting the Palestinian government's assumption of its responsibilities throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, the deployment of a UN-mandated mission throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, achieving a complete, comprehensive and permanent ceasefire, and supporting an end of the occupation, Palestinian independence, implementing the two-state solution, and achieving shared peace and security. This is a historical moment where everyone must choose where they stand and what vision they want to see prevail. The next few days are decisive and can either set us on the right path or the wrong one, with huge implications for the region and the world. Help us in these few days to have the ceasefire in place, not the continuation of war. Life must prevail. Liberty must prevail. Peace must prevail. You are the mighty Security Council. Act, help us, and I thank you very much, Madam President.
And I thank the permanent observer. I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. We stand firm in our commitment to return the hostages and defeat Hamas, and it's time for the international community to take our commitment seriously. We will bring home every lost hostage. Hamas has refused to release our hostages and repeatedly rejected all the offers, both by the US and the mediating countries, even for the period of Ramadan. And thus, the return to fighting is a necessity. The IDF is attacking targets of the Hamas terrorist organization to achieve our objectives. These precise attacks include Hamas terrorist commanders, terrorist cells, launch posts, weapon stockpiles, and additional military infrastructure that are being used by these terrorist organizations to continue to plan and execute attacks against Israeli civilians and IDF soldiers. However, we are drawn into a discussion today not to alleviate suffering, not to seek truth, but to indulge the political agenda of certain members of this Council. Those who wield humanitarian rhetoric and feign concern as a weapon, turning a blind eye to the primary cause of suffering in Gaza, the Hamas terrorist organization, which continues to hold 59 innocent hostages. For those truly concerned about humanitarian crises, there is one that should be paramount: the hostages still held in Hamas's brutal captivity. Men, women, children, the elderly, innocents ripped from their homes and subjected to horrors beyond comprehension. Many are already believed to be dead, while others continue to be tormented day after day. For over a year and 4 months, they have been deprived of sunlight, medical care, the comfort of their family's embrace. Their conditions are unknown, their treatment unimaginable. This is the most urgent humanitarian crisis, and yet those who claim to be the loudest voices for human rights have somehow lost their voices on this matter. So let us be clear: any discussion of humanitarian suffering that does not begin with the hostage release is not an honest discussion. For months, Israel took unprecedented steps to facilitate humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israel's war is against Hamas, not Gaza's civilians. And yet, despite our efforts, Hamas refuses every opportunity for peace. It refuses to release the hostages. Over a 6-week period between January and February alone, Israel facilitated the entry of an unprecedented amount of humanitarian aid into Gaza, over 25,000 aid trucks, averaging more than 4,200 trucks per week. These trucks carried food, medical supplies, and essential goods. This is not speculation, not political rhetoric. This is in fact documented, verifiable, and confirmed by the organizations distributing and supplying the aid. In addition to the thousands of aid trucks, bakeries are operational across Gaza, producing millions of loaves of bread daily. In northern Gaza alone, increased fuel deliveries resulted in a 40% increase in bakery output. The slander that the people of Gaza are currently starving is quite simply untrue. Fuel and gas deliveries also continued over this period. Nearly 1,000 fuel tankers entered Gaza, including 275 to the north. Claims that the electricity cutoff has plunged Gaza into humanitarian collapse are greatly exaggerated, particularly regarding water infrastructure. Water pipes and sewage repair materials were sent to northern Gaza, ensuring that infrastructure remains functional. During the same 6-week period, over 840,000 tents were delivered. This was a massive logistical undertaking supported by international partners and facilitated by Israel. Madam President, let us be very clear. If there is suffering in Gaza, it is not because of a lack of aid. It is because Hamas has hijacked an entire civilian population for its own violent ends. Hamas diverts food, Hamas hoards fuel, Hamas transforms hospitals, schools, and UN facilities into command centers, ensuring that even in the presence of humanitarian aid, suffering persists. But somehow, in the debates of this Council, Hamas is an afterthought, a footnote, a mere inconvenience in the preferred narrative. And so, instead of asking why Hamas continues to prolong this war, instead of asking why Hamas rejected a ceasefire extension that would have freed civilians from suffering, instead of asking why Hamas holds hostages in horrific conditions, instead of asking these questions, certain members choose instead to malign Israel, the only party in this conflict undertaking their humanitarian obligations and taking steps to meet them. Israel will not be lectured by those who exploit human suffering for political gain. If this Council wishes to address suffering, then it must demand the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. There can be no progress until this occurs. There can be no relenting against the evil that we face. The massive amounts of humanitarian aid which Israel coordinated and facilitated, at least those amounts not seized by Hamas, have reached every segment of Gaza's population, with one tragic exception: the hostages. While Gazan civilians benefit from food, medicine, shelter, and support, these innocent individuals languish in conditions that defy human comprehension, a stark reminder of the vast moral inequivalence between Israel and Hamas. The release of the hostages is the first, the most urgent, the most fundamental step towards ending this war. The people of Gaza deserve a future free from Hamas and the pain that they wrought. The innocent Israelis wasting away in Hamas's tunnel network must once again feel the sun on their faces and embrace their loved ones. This is the only true path to peace. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Majid Abdulaziz, Permanent Observer of the League of Arab States to the United Nations.
Shukran, Sayyida Raisa.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm honored to make this statement today on behalf of the League of Arab States and its member states. I would like to begin by expressing our appreciation for your excellent stewardship of the work of the Council and for positively responding to the request by the Arab Group, the League of Arab States and other member states to hold this meeting to promote international work through the Council to address Israel's resumption of its brutal military bombardment of Gaza and for the continued deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip due to the continued restrictions by Israel on the entry of humanitarian assistance in the continuation of the policy of starvation and forced thirst that is internationally prohibited. We would like to express our appreciation to USG Fletcher for the important briefing and the constructive suggestions. Madam President, the Arab Summit in the Bahrain Declaration on the 16th of May 2024 has stressed, and this has been reaffirmed in the Cairo communique of the extraordinary Arab Summit that was held under the slogan, the Palestine summit on the 4th of March 2025. Both have condemned policies of starvation and scorched earth tactics aimed at forcing the Palestinian people to leave their land. The Cairo summit condemned the Israeli government's recent decision to halt humanitarian aid to Gaza and close relief crossings. The summit also decided to reject Israel's use of blockade as a weapon and the starvation of civilians as a means to achieve political gain. It also stressed the utmost priority of the continuation of the implementation of the second and third phases of the ceasefire agreement. All this, Madam President, stresses the crucial link between the comprehensive and full ceasefire in accordance with the agreement based on the U.S., Qatari, and Egyptian mediation, and to allow the entry of humanitarian assistance without interruption and in big volumes, as well as starting the implementation of the first phase of the plan proposed by Egypt in full coordination with the State of Palestine and Arab states, and based on studies that were conducted by the World Bank and the UNDP on early recovery and the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. This plan was adopted by the Cairo summit as a pan-Arab plan, and it was also adopted by the ministerial meeting of the OIC at a later point in time. The Israeli war on Gaza of more than 470 days have killed more than 48,000 Palestinians, including 18,000 children and 13,000 women. And it almost completely destroyed health and educational and infrastructure facilities and all necessities of life in Gaza. The resumption of the brutal military intensive bombardment of the Gaza Strip and the killing of more than 400 Gazans in Gaza yesterday, and Israel's intensification of the policy of blockade and starvation on the Gaza Strip, and the most recent of which was the decision by the Israeli Ministry of Power to cut the power supply to the vital sectors, including the main desalination water plant. This has added forced thirst to starvation. It aggravates the suffering of more than 2 million Palestinians living in unbearable conditions. These attacks and measures are inhumane, condemned, and unacceptable. They are nothing but collective punishment by Israel, perpetrated by Israel against the defenseless Palestinians, counter to humanitarian principles and values which constitute the very foundation and mission of this organization. This is a challenge to the international will that has supported the ceasefire. In light of the deterioration of this crisis and Israel's resumption of its intensive military bombardment in Gaza yesterday, the Arab group stresses that the Council needs to shoulder its responsibility this time and to compel Israel to honor its obligations under the ceasefire agreement, including opening all crossings to humanitarian aid and the delivery of medical and fuel items and shelter items, and to restore electricity to the entirety of the Strip, including the water plants, and to meet the basic needs of the people and to alleviate their suffering. The group warns against the Council not taking such measures, which ushers in a catastrophic human disaster with unpredictable consequences. The Arab group and the League of Arab States stresses that the continuation of this crisis and the obstruction of delivery of aid or preventing aid from getting in is a major and a grave violation of Israel's obligations as the occupying power under the international law, UN resolutions, and the rules of human rights, and the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, and the advisory opinion of the ICG issued in July 2024, and the provisional measures of the ICJ as well, and all the resolutions adopted by the Security Council and the GA based on the ICJ measures and orders. The group and the League stress that the Council needs to activate international oversight mechanisms to guarantee the delivery of aid safely and in a sustainable manner to all Palestinians in need. There needs to be a promotion of international efforts to ensure the protection of civilian Palestinians and to meet their basic needs immediately and effectively. We stress in this regard the central humanitarian role of UNRWA in Gaza, which cannot be replaced by any other entity. We stress the importance of the continued work of UNRWA to provide its vital services to Palestine refugees according to its UN mandate. Madam President, the Arab Group commends the tireless efforts spearheaded by Qatar, Egypt, and the US to reach a ceasefire agreement in Gaza, including the release of detainees and hostages. We stress the need for the Council to exercise utmost pressure on Israel to end its military aggression that was resumed yesterday and to complete the implementation of the ceasefire agreement, including the second and third phases and all its elements. This would lead to reaching a permanent end of the aggression on Gaza and Israel's full withdrawal from the Strip, and to facilitate the return of Gazans to the areas of residence, including in the north, in line with Security Council resolutions, most notably Resolution 2735. The Group and the League stress the need to build on those efforts to begin the implementation of the Arab Early Recovery and Reconstruction Plan. We commend the efforts of Egypt and the State of Palestine to prepare for an international conference on reconstruction in cooperation with the UN, which will be hosted by Cairo very soon. And we urge our international community partners and IFIs to provide all financial and political support to ensure the implementation of this ambitious plan by Palestinian lands towards the rehabilitation and reconstruction of the Strip at the desired pace. We stress the importance that this plan would coincide with international effort towards sustainable peace and lasting peace, to protect the rights of the Palestinian people and to achieve their aspirations in freedom and statehood, and joining the UN as a full-fledged member, and the effort to make the international conference that will be held in June 2025 under the French-Saudi presidency a success as part of the two-state initiative effort that is receiving mounting international support every day. In closing, the Arab Group and the League of Arab States reaffirms their full solidarity with the Palestinian people and their strong support to its historic steadfastness on its land as it adheres to its land and refuses to be forcibly displaced. We stress that continued military operations, siege, starvation, forced thirst, oppressive measures perpetrated by Israel will only lead to further deterioration of the humanitarian and security situation, threatening the security of the entire region. We reiterate that the only solution to this conflict is by ending the Israeli occupation, guaranteeing the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the establishment of their independent, sovereign state with East Jerusalem as its capital on the basis of the two-state solution and the Arab Peace Initiative, and the State of Palestine joining as a full-fledged member of the United Nations. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abdul Aziz for the statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I couldn't help but notice that some of the behavior during this meeting, including departing from the chamber and leaving a seat vacant while the representative of Israel was speaking under Rule 37, is inconsistent with the decorum that we expect in this chamber, and I just wanted to register that. I thank you.
And I thank the United States, the representative of the United States, for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.